The sacrifice of Isaac, a study of Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22 is one of the most well-known and challenging passages in the Bible. In this chapter, God tested Abraham's faith by asking him to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac. This narrative, often called the binding of Isaac or the Akedah, has been the subject of extensive theological discussion, scholarly debate, and artistic interpretation for centuries. It raises questions about obedience, faith, divine testing, and the nature of sacrifice. The chapter opens with a clear directive from God: take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Genesis 22:2. This command immediately sets a tone of urgency and profound testing. For Abraham, Isaac is not only his beloved son, but also the child through whom God had promised to establish a great nation. Genesis 17, verse 19. The command appears to contradict the promises God had made, creating a tension between divine promise and divine demand. Abraham's willingness to obey, even in the face of such a painful and seemingly irrational command, serves as a powerful demonstration of his faith and trust in God. Abraham's journey with Isaac is described in detail. Early in the chapter, we read that Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his servants along with Isaac. He then set out for the place God had told him about, Genesis 22:3. This journey is not only a physical one, but also a spiritual passage. The narrative emphasizes Abraham's calm acceptance of God's command. Despite the emotional turmoil he must have felt, Abraham does not question the order, but follows it step by step. This act of obedience is central to understanding the message of the chapter. Hebrews 11:17-19 further reflects on Abraham's faith, noting that he trusted God even when asked to sacrifice his son, and believed that God could raise him from the dead if necessary. Such a statement highlights that Abraham's faith was not based on the promise of a safe outcome, but on the character of God himself. As Abraham and Isaac approach the designated mountain, the tension in the narrative builds. The text describes how they arrived at the place God had indicated, and Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Genesis 22:9. Then he bound Isaac and laid him on the altar. It is at this critical moment that the reader is confronted with the intensity of Abraham's test. One can imagine the emotional agony and internal conflict that Abraham must have experienced. His loyalty to God, the promise of descendants through Isaac, and his profound love for his son, all coming into direct conflict with the command he was given. At this moment of crisis, an angel of the Lord calls out to Abraham from heaven, saying, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Genesis 22:12. This divine intervention is crucial. It halts Abraham's intended sacrifice and signals that his faith and obedience have been proven. The angel's words reveal that God never intended for Isaac to be sacrificed. Rather, the command was a test of Abraham's faith. This twist in the narrative provides a powerful message about trust in God. It teaches that God values genuine faith and obedience, even when faced with difficult, seemingly impossible challenges. The chapter continues with a shift in the narrative tone. Abraham, relieved and overjoyed, sees a ram caught by its horns in a thicket nearby. He then sacrifices the ram as a burnt offering instead of Isaac. Genesis 22:13-14. This substitution has been interpreted by many scholars as a foreshadowing of later theological concepts in which God provides a substitute for humanity's sins. In Christian theology, this moment is seen as a precursor to the idea of Jesus Christ as the Lamb of God who would be sacrificed for the sins of the world. John 1:29. Even within the Jewish tradition, the ram sacrifice is viewed as a symbol of God's mercy and provision, demonstrating that while human obedience is essential, God ultimately provides a way out of even the most challenging tests. The concluding verses of Genesis 22 emphasize the blessings that follow Abraham's demonstration of faith. The angel of the Lord calls out again to Abraham and reaffirms God's promise, saying, "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed." because you have obeyed me. Genesis 22:15-18. This promise reinforces the earlier covenant God made with Abraham in Genesis 17, and it serves as a powerful reminder that faithfulness to God brings about divine blessings even when the path is filled with hardship and sacrifice. The narrative of Genesis 22 has been the subject of considerable scholarly commentary and debate. Walter Brueggemann, a noted Old Testament scholar, points out that the binding of Isaac is a story of paradox, where a seemingly impossible command tests faith and results in an affirmation of the covenant. Brueggemann emphasizes that the story is not meant to be taken as a literal model for human sacrifice, but rather as a profound demonstration of trust in God's goodness and faithfulness. Similarly, John Goldingay, another respected biblical scholar, has argued that the text is meant to challenge readers to consider the lengths to which true faith will go, even when the demands of that faith seem to conflict with human emotions and social norms. Another important aspect of Genesis 22 is the way it addresses the concept of divine testing. The story raises difficult questions about why God would test someone by asking them to sacrifice what they love most. Some scholars argue that the test was not meant to suggest that God delights in human suffering, but that it was designed to reveal the true depth of Abraham's devotion. In Hebrews 11, often referred to as the Hall of Faith, Abraham is celebrated precisely because he was willing to trust God even under the most extreme circumstances. This perspective encourages believers to see tests and trials not as signs of divine cruelty, but as opportunities to grow in faith and to experience God's grace more fully. The ethical and moral implications of the story are also significant. In modern times, the idea of a father being asked to sacrifice his child is disturbing and raises questions about the nature of faith and obedience. However, many scholars caution against reading the story solely through a contemporary lens. Instead, it should be understood within its ancient Near Eastern context, where the concepts of covenant, sacrifice, and divine testing were viewed differently. In that context, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac was seen as the ultimate act of loyalty to God, and God's intervention affirmed that true faith does not require human sacrifice. This understanding helps modern readers appreciate the radical nature of Abraham's obedience without endorsing the practice of human sacrifice. The story of the binding of Isaac has also influenced art, literature, and culture throughout history. Artists such as Caravaggio and Rembrandt have depicted the dramatic moment when Abraham raises his knife, capturing the emotional intensity and spiritual significance of the event. These works of art serve as visual commentaries on the themes of sacrifice, faith, and divine intervention. Literary works have similarly drawn on the story to explore themes of obedience, trust, and the nature of divine testing. The widespread influence of the story demonstrates its enduring power and its ability to speak to fundamental human experiences. From a theological standpoint, Genesis 22 is central to both Jewish and Christian traditions. In Judaism, the story of the Akedah is commemorated during Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, as a reminder of Abraham's unyielding faith and the covenant between God and his people. In Christianity, the story is often seen as a prefiguration of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Just as Abraham was willing to sacrifice his beloved son, God provided his only son as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. John 3:16. This typology is central to Christian theology, emphasizing themes of substitutionary atonement and divine love. Genesis 22 invites believers to reflect on the nature of sacrifice. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is not presented as an end in itself, but as a means to demonstrate trust in God's ultimate goodness. The fact that God ultimately provides a ram as a substitute for Isaac underscores the idea that true sacrifice is not about the loss of what is most dear, but about surrendering one's will to God in faith. This message challenges modern believers to consider what they are willing to give up in order to follow God and to trust in His plan, even when it seems to require great personal cost. It also provides practical lessons for personal growth and spiritual discipline. The narrative encourages readers to cultivate a deep and abiding trust in God, even when life presents challenging and seemingly contradictory demands. It invites believers to examine their own willingness to obey God's commands, to consider the true meaning of sacrifice, and to recognize that God's promises often require acts of faith that go beyond what is comfortable or easily understood. Such reflections can lead to a more mature and resilient faith, one that is capable of enduring trials and emerging stronger in one's relationship with God. Scholarly discussions of Genesis 22 often highlight the literary techniques used in the narrative. For example, the gradual buildup of tension as Abraham and Isaac journey to the place of sacrifice, the use of dramatic irony when the reader anticipates the impending tragedy, and the sudden, unexpected divine intervention all contribute to a powerful narrative structure. These literary elements work together to emphasize the central message of the chapter, that faith, even when tested by the most extreme circumstances, is ultimately rewarded by God. John Goldingay, 2003, notes that the careful construction of the narrative invites readers to experience the emotional and spiritual intensity of Abraham's trial, and thereby to appreciate the profound depth of his devotion. Another point of discussion among scholars is the symbolic significance of Isaac in the narrative. Isaac is not merely the object of Abraham's sacrifice, he also symbolizes the future of the covenant and the hope of divine fulfillment. His near sacrifice foreshadows themes of death and resurrection that are later central to Christian theology. Hebrews 11:17-19 uses Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as an example of faith that looks forward to a future resurrection, where God is able to raise the dead. This connection between the near sacrifice of Isaac and the hope of resurrection provides a rich theological background for understanding the narrative's lasting impact. It is also important to note that the story raises ethical and moral questions that have been debated by theologians and ethicists. While many view Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as an act of supreme faith, others wrestle with the moral implications of a divine command that appears to ask for human sacrifice. These debates remind us that the narrative is complex and multi-layered, challenging readers to engage with difficult questions about obedience, morality, and the nature of God. Scholars like Walter Brueggemann, 1982, argue that the story must be understood as a theophany, a dramatic revelation of God's character, and not as a prescription for human behavior. In other words, while the story shows the extremes of divine testing, it also reveals that God ultimately does not desire human sacrifice. Instead, he provides a means of redemption and restoration. Genesis 22 stands as a powerful and enduring narrative within the Bible. It presents the story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac as a test of faith, a moment that ultimately affirms God's promises and his mercy. The chapter explores themes of obedience, divine testing, and the nature of sacrifice, while also offering hope through the promise of divine intervention and blessing. For both Jewish and Christian traditions, the Akedah serves as a foundational story that illustrates the depth of faith required to trust in God's ultimate plan. Supported by biblical references such as Genesis 22:1-19 and Hebrews 11:17-19, as well as scholarly insights from figures like Walter Brueggemann, John Goldingay, and Leon Morris, Genesis 22 continues to inspire deep reflection on the nature of faith and obedience. For modern readers, the narrative challenges us to consider what we are willing to sacrifice in our own lives for the sake of our beliefs and our trust in God. It reminds us that true faith often involves difficult choices and profound personal cost, yet it also promises that God's mercy and provision will prevail in the end. The story of Abraham and Isaac invites each believer to examine the strength of their own faith, to commit wholeheartedly to following God's will, and to trust that even the most challenging tests are opportunities for growth and deeper understanding. In the end, Genesis chapter 22 is more than just an ancient story. It is a timeless lesson in the power of faith, the importance of trust, and the assurance that God's promises endure despite human imperfection. By embracing the lessons of this chapter, believers are encouraged to live with integrity, to honor the covenant relationship with God, and to find hope in the knowledge that God is always working for the good of those who love Him.